In this lesson, we'll look at floating as a means of layout control. With absolute positioning, we made modifications to the layout of our page with respect to the browser window. With floating, we will position elements in our HTML code close to where we want them to appear when viewed in a web browser. But by using CSS, we will assign that element a specific width and instruct, by using the float property, the other elements on our page to fill in around the element that we're floating. Let's take a look at how we do this. In the Chapter 8 folder, if I double-click on lesson_04_home.htm, we'll see a web page which looks very much like that of the previous lessons. And I'm going to open lesson_04_home.htm and the accompanying CSS file in my HTML editor, which in this case is TextEdit. And I'll open the CSS file as well by dragging the CSS file onto my TextEdit icon on my desktop. I'll close the Chapter 8 folder down, and I'll switch back over to my browser for a moment, and I'll look at my side content column. What I would like to do is I would like this side content column to always be on the right-hand side as it is right now, but as I resize my browser window, I might like this column to move with the browser, and I might like my content space on the left-hand side of my screen to fill in the gap in between my main content and side content. Well, currently, these items are fixed in place using absolute positioning. So I'm going to change the mechanism that is putting this side content div, that being a div with an ID attribute referencing a side content named CSS rule, which we defined in a previous lesson, and I'm going to remove from that side content CSS rule my absolute positioning and use floating to control this element. So if I switch back over to my HTML editor, to the CSS file we just opened up, I'll scroll back down and find the area that governs the layout of elements on my page, which we can see here, and we can see the side content ID, which we defined to include absolute positioning instructions. With these items selected, I'm going to hit the delete key to remove the absolute positioning on the side content, and in its place, I'll put float and assign a float direction of right, because I want this side content column to literally float off to the right-hand side of my screen. So we'll put down the value right for the property float. Now I'll save this CSS file from the File menu and switch over to my browser and hit reload and see what happens. Now I mentioned at the very beginning of the lesson we need to modify our HTML so that the element that we intend to float appears in the HTML relatively close to where we want the element to be positioned or observed in the web browser. That's not what we're seeing here. If I scroll down, I can see my side content is floating off on the right-hand side. So my CSS is functioning properly, but my HTML needs a little bit of modification. So I'll switch back over again to my HTML editor, except this time I'll be sure to look at my HTML file. And let's go down and find the region of our HTML file in which this div, which is our right-hand side content. And here we can find it right before the closing body tag. Now, we would like, and I'll switch over to the web browser and shrink the window down a little bit so I can get the two on the screen at the same time. We would like this right-hand side column to appear in approximately the same place that it was at before, down underneath the main banner image, horizontally on the same level as my main content, but positioned to the right of that main content. Right now, when I look at the HTML, I can see that this side content comes literally in the flow of my HTML file after everything else. And we don't want that. So I'm going to click with my left mouse button and drag a range on these lines of code so that they're selected in blue. And then from the Edit menu, I'm going to cut, and I'm going to paste that div after my main banner image, which I can see is right here just after the main body tag. So I'll add a few returns, and then from the Edit menu, select Paste. Now with certainty, I would like to know that this image, which I have on my page right now, will behave as a block element. We know from previous lessons that block elements have their own break as far as the page is concerned. I don't have to assign a break to jump down to the next line for a block element. So I'm going to quickly put this image inside a paragraph element, just so that I'll know this image is being treated as a block element, because paragraphs are a block element. Now, with my image contained within a block element, my side content ID attribute telling this div to float to the right after my banner graphic, and with my main content div containing the bulk of the page content, all flowing in the order in which I'd like to see them, from the File menu I'll select Save, and switch back over to my web browser and click Reload. And now I can see this page looks a little bit better. But if I stretch that browser window out, I don't see the main content expanding horizontally. As my side content drifts off in space, literally off in space, a gap is opening up between the two. That's because we assigned a fixed width to the ID that's governing the width of this div. So if we would like this div to expand horizontally, we're going to have to modify the rule which governs the layout of the main content. So let's switch back over to our HTML editor and bring up our CSS file and find our main content ID. We can see our fixed width of 408 pixels on the second line. I'll highlight that in blue with my mouse by clicking and dragging so that it becomes selected, so that I can hit the delete key on my keyboard. But I do have to assign some sort of instruction here to govern how that div should be spaced horizontally, otherwise the page is not going to look correct. And the way that I interpret correct as the designer, when looking at this page, I would like the width of this main content div to occupy the entire width of the page, except for the width occupied by this side content column and a tiny little gap in between the two, because I don't want this div right up against this div. I like a little bit of space between the two, like we have between our main banner graphic and the main content div. So I'll switch back over to my HTML editor, and we've seen in the past when we talked about the box model concept that we can assign a margin to an element. And in this case, I'll assign a margin on the right of this main content div of 220 pixels, because my side content is 200 pixels wide, which we can see here in the next rule down in our CSS file, and I'd like a little bit more space than just 200 pixels. Otherwise my two divs, my main content and side content, will be snug up against each other. So I'll assign a margin of 220 pixels on the right-hand side. Now, if I save this file from the File menu and select Save to save my CSS, and switch over to my browser and hit Reload, I can see my main content div has expanded horizontally. And if I adjust the width of my browser window, I can see that main content resizes, and my side content div floats off to the right of that with a consistent amount of space between the side content and the main content. I'm going to quickly add another div governed by an ID to the bottom of the page. What I'd like is a small footer to go across the entire width of the bottom of the page. So I'll quickly write a CSS rule to govern the presentation and layout of that div, just like we've done with our main content and side content divs. And then I'll switch over to the HTML file create a div tag with a bit of content and reference that ID by way of an attribute. Since we've seen this before, I'll do this quickly, but not too fast. I'm going to follow this naming structure that I've come up with, and I'll just call this region, whose formatting I'm defining here in CSS, footer content. Open curly bracket, a couple of returns, and tab over a few times and put in my closing curly bracket so that I don't forget. And now I'll just assign some simple formatting real quick, similar to the formatting we've already seen, such as background color. And I'll set that to a shade of gray, which I looked up in Photoshop a little while back. And I'll assign text properties such that the text will be center justified by using the text align property with a center value. And I'll give a little bit of padding so that any content in my div is not flush up against the edges of the div. Now I'll save my CSS file, and I might even copy the name of my ID into memory before I leave my CSS file, in case I forget what it is when I'm editing my HTML, so that when I switch over to my HTML file, which I'm doing in my HTML editing tool, and scroll down to the bottom of the page, so inside my HTML file before the closing body tag, we can create our new div tag, which I'll close immediately after I create it. And within that div tag, we can put some copy, such as my Astro website. Please check back again soon. And to get that formatting onto this div, which we defined in our CSS file, we'll use the ID attribute, which we've seen before. And I still have in memory the name of the ID, which we just defined, which I'll paste and type the close quote. So now, when I save this file from the File menu and switch over to our browser and reload and scroll down, we can see that we now have a footer with a little bit of text inside. Now we've set this situation up, the situation being a footer down at the bottom of the page, to see what happens when we populate more content into our side content div, and when that div gets close to our footer content at the bottom. Right now we only have a little scrap of Latin text inside our side content div. And for consistency, you can see that because that side content has a paragraph element inside it, and our paragraph element inherits text properties, I might want to put a paragraph element around the copy inside our footer content div at the bottom of the page, so that when I save the page and refresh, the same text properties which we see in the side content div appear in the footer content as well. If you take a look back out in the Chapter 8 folder, you'll find a file called theplanets.txt. I'm going to double click on that file so that it opens in TextEdit. And you can see a list of the 8 planets. Even though it got demoted, if you're a Pluto fan, you can type in the name Pluto too, because nobody seems to know what Pluto is. Dwarf planet, regular planet, who knows? Disney character. These headings are essentially filler content, which I'm selecting so that I can copy this code into memory and switch over to my HTML file so that I can paste that copy inside my side content div, rather than have this little snippet of Latin, which I'll select by highlighting in blue and hitting the return key a couple of times, so that I can paste those blocks of code which are in the planets text file in the Chapter 8 folder. I'm just tabbing these over a little bit so that the page is a little cleaner. And I'll also select them again and paste them again so that I have a big list of headings. Now I'm doing that to exaggerate a point inside the page. and to see where I'm going, we'll reload the page. Look at our side content, feel good about all of our content flowing along the right-hand side of our main content, until we look at the footer and say, what the heck is going on here? The right-hand side content div has shot right past the footer. This is usually the moment when grumbling and groaning occurs. But we don't need to do that because we know what's going on. And what's going on is the absence of an instruction to the browser to not allow a floating element to interact with our footer element in a particular way. In this case, I don't want any floating element, such as my side content div, to float past my footer div. Fortunately, there's a property which allows us to say we don't want this to happen, which we can specify by switching back over to our HTML editor. I don't need the planets anymore, I can close them down. And I'll bring up my CSS file using the window menu and selecting lesson_04_home.css. And I will scroll down and find the footer content rule so that I can add a necessary property, that property being clear, so that I can clear floats. And in this case, I don't want any floats to occur on the right of my footer content element. Now, if I save this CSS file from the File menu and select Save, switch back over to my web browser and hit Reload, the page has changed, but it's changed for the better. My side content div still contains this double long list of the planets, but the side content div will not push past my footer div. It'll push it down, but it can't shoot past it, which is exactly what we want. And I can see that that is consistent even when I resize the web page.